to introduce our speaker, Reverend Stephen McAfee.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you. I was not raised Southern Baptist, but I want to just make a comment on that. One of the things I've noticed over the years that I have done as well is we pick and choose things from the Bible that we like and reject the things that make us uncomfortable or we don't want to deal with. And my experience is that's not a great way to study because you miss huge chunks of things. And in things that are uncomfortable for you, it doesn't necessarily mean they're wrong. It might mean that you don't understand them yet. If you were to look at the mission of Yeshua or Jesus and say, well, all this stuff is pretty good, but the prayer part, don't think I'm going to do that. That's kind of awkward and weird, and I'm not going to bother with that. You'd be missing a really significant portion of his teaching, and more importantly, missing a really big opportunity in your life. Laying on of hands was something they did his entire ministry. Every single time they healed somebody, every single time they blessed somebody, every single time they ordained an apostle, every single time they initiated somebody. That was an important piece of what he taught and did. And so I just want to suggest maybe you look at that because there's something there. So I'm not saying we have to all suddenly start doing that. But I am suggesting that we all look at that and anything else in the Bible you think, I can ignore that. Maybe take another look at it and go, what am I missing here? Because there aren't irrelevant things there. So the reason it's endured is because it works. So anyway, thank you for that. So I'm not talking about that today, though. But I was just moved to share that because it's been important in my life. And actually I'm going to tell you one more short thing. I may or may not get around to what I was planning on talking about. But because Wanda's so good, she always sparks these things, for me. But I actually saw a man one time who was a traditional Christian and did evangelical work with like revivals, on the road, the big old tents and stuff, that kind of stuff. And they would do healing things. I don't know if you've ever been to one of those, but they would do healing things where they call people up and they place their hands on them and pray for them. And sometimes these apparently miraculous healings occur. Some people think that's all a scam. Probably sometimes it is, but probably sometimes it isn't. And there was a minister telling a story about this man who came to him and had suffered with this horrible skin condition for almost a decade, kind of like the story of the woman hemorrhaging in the Bible. And nothing worked. And asked if this minister would pray for him. This is in front of a large gathering of people. And so the minister says, sure. So he comes up and he prays for the man. And nothing happens. And the man is crying and his family's crying. And the minister's upset that nothing happened. And the man starts to turn away. And the minister said after the fact, when he told this story, he literally heard God speak to him, saying, I said the laying on of hands, not the laying near of hands. And he called the man back and put his hands on him, on the skin condition that was contagious, and prayed for him, and all of the sores began to close. And the minister never caught the skin condition. So I didn't see that, but that was an inspirational thing to me to realize how many times I adjust what I've been taught to make myself more comfortable instead of doing what I was told. So I don't mean by worldly authorities, I mean inside. Sometimes I don't do what worldly authorities tell me to do. So back to my talk, which isn't there anymore. But that might be a sign. But, it's called the Ark of the Covenant. So all of you know about the Ark of the Covenant, if only from Indiana Jones. And the Ark of the Covenant was a really important thing, again, in the development of what became Judaism, which eventually had a branch that became called Christianity. And the Ark of the Covenant was a box. It was basically a 4 foot by 2.5 foot by 2.5 foot box, and that they were instructed to build. But the interesting thing is, if you read the Old Testament, and if you haven't done that for a while, that's worth doing too. When the Hebrew people, who hadn't yet become Jews, but when the Hebrew people were freed from their enslavement in Egypt by Moses and followed him to the Promised Land, which, by the way, if you ever look on a map from back then, an old map of where they started and where they ended up, that journey on foot takes 11 days. Took them 40 years. So they wandered around a lot. And as you know, the reason was Mrs. Moses said, "Why don't you ask for directions?" And Mr. Moses said, "I know a shortcut." So took them a while. But anyway, how they traveled was they had this ark. And at night, there was a pillar of fire all around the ark. And when the pillar of fire moved, the entire encampment followed it. And when the pillar of fire stopped, they stopped and camped. And if the pillar of fire stayed fixed, they stayed there as long as it stayed. And as soon as it moved, they broke camp and followed it again. And during the day, it looked like a cloud, like a radiant cloud. So it's called the cloud of glory in the Bible, or the pillar of fire. And it's always directly above the ark. The ark was a box, so I'm going to show you just a couple of particular things about it, so that I don't get it wrong. I actually wrote down quotes from the Bible. By the way, it's made of acacia wood. I didn't know what acacia wood was, so I had to look that up. Acacia wood is 55% stronger than oak, and water resistant and fungus resistant. It was one of the strongest and most durable woods they had back then, which I thought was interesting. But in Exodus, this is from the book of Exodus, Exodus chapter 25, verse 9, God says to build this ark. And he says, "Build it according to the pattern that I will teach you." Now that can be interpreted to mean build this ark exactly the way I tell you. But it can also mean that the ark is the pattern that I am teaching you. That there's something in the ark that is a pattern for you to learn. So I'm going to get back to that. And it was overlaid with gold everywhere, so it was very amazing. And it was placed in the tabernacle, which was the holy place while they were traveling. Once they actually settled in Israel, they built a temple, and the temple is built on the same pattern as the tabernacle was. And the tabernacle has three parts. It has an outer sanctuary, where people can discourse and interact and do things. Then it has what's called the sanctuary. And the sanctuary is a place where the priests go, not the public, but the priests. And in the sanctuary, there is a menorah, or candle stand. There is incense, and there is bread. That's what's there. Then there's a giant curtain, 30 feet, this is not 30 feet, 30 feet tall, that runs the width of it and separates the sanctuary from what's called the inner sanctuary, or the Holy of Holies. And in the Holy of Holies is where they kept the ark. And the only person that could go into that room with the ark was the high priest. One person with the ark. So what's the big deal with all that? Who cares? So in us, we have this outer self, this outer courtyard, where we engage with the world, and we interact with people, and we do things in our life in the world. Then we have this inner space that Unity talks about all the time, going within, bringing your attention within, the Christ light within, the indwelling presence, all those things, the spark of God. There's this inner part of us that's called the holy place, or the sanctuary. But in that holy place, when we come in here, and we just bring our attention inside, but we don't go to the center, but just inside, what we find is not only is there the holy place there, the sanctuary, but we find tons of thoughts, tons of feelings, tons of things going on in our consciousness that may or may not be very godlike, frankly. You can bring your attention inside and still be thinking horrible things. You can bring your attention inside and still emotionally feel awful, but your attention's still inside. But there's a deeper place inside. It's called the Holy of Holies. And there's only two things that exist there, God and you. Nothing else. Your soul and God. Not the world, not your thoughts about the world, not your belief systems, not how you feel about things, not what's going on in your body. Just the Spirit of God and your soul. That's all that's there. That is the Holy of Holies. That's the pattern, one of the patterns that we were being taught with the ark. Now, let me read you a couple of other things. They're to build something that ended up being called the mercy seat. It's a lid for this box. And on the lid for the box, they are to make a covering of pure gold so that it fits the box. And then they are to fashion a cherub at one end on the lid and a cherub at the other end on the lid. We might think of cherubs as those cute little hallmarky things, or whoever makes them, those little babies with the cute butts, those cherubs. No. Cherubs were gigantic, powerful angelic guardians in the Bible, that when people beheld them, they were very afraid, to the point that the cherubs had to say, "Don't be afraid." So they were guardians, and they had wings. So this says, "You shall place one cherub at one end of the cover and the other at the other. The cherubs shall have their wings spread upward to cover the ark, and they will be facing one another. And you shall place this cover on top of the ark. And there is where I will meet with you. From above this cover, from the space between the two cherubim." So now there's two cherubim, if you've ever seen pictures of the ark, bowing toward one another, and their wingtips are almost touching, and there's a space between their faces and their wings, an empty space. And that is where God spoke to Moses, from that space, or to the high priest, from that space. Now, we'll get back to that too. What was in the ark? What they placed in the ark was the rod of Aaron. Do you remember the story of Aaron's rod flowering? That's one of the things that was in the ark, was Aaron's rod. Do you remember the story of manna, where they were fed somehow with divine intervention in the wilderness? This stuff called manna. It was a basket of manna that they saved, and that was in the ark. Now you remember the story of the two tablets, where Moses went up Mount Sinai, got the teachings from God, what we later called the Ten Commandments. They were written on two tablets of stone. He came down with those two tablets, discovered that in that 40 days, his brother, whom he entrusted with leadership, and the rest of his people were all worshiping Egyptian idols. And so he was very upset, and he broke the two tablets. I hope this is a familiar story. So those are shattered. Then later he goes back up the mountain and talks with God again and receives two more tablets, and he brings those down, and those are the two tablets of the Torah, or the law, or the instructions. Those two tablets, the whole ones, and the staff of Aaron and the manna were what they carried in the box of the ark. But you know what else they put in the box of the ark? All the broken pieces of the first tablets. So the teaching is that when we move through our life, we carry our brokenness with us. And we carry our wholeness with us. We carry both, and both makes us who we are. We learn from how we've been broken, and we learn how to be whole. They first had to experience what it was to have that brokenness. And until you've been broken, it's really difficult to have compassion for somebody because you don't understand what brokenness is. But once you do, it's really hard to walk by somebody who's broken and not want to help. So we carry that brokenness and wholeness within us, and they recognize that, and we're instructed to take that with them wherever they went. Okay, so the inner chamber where the ark was kept, by the way, had these, in addition to the tiny cherubim on top of the ark, they were to build two standing cherubim, 15 feet tall. That's pretty big. And the cherubim were to have their wings outstretched so that one cherubim's wing touched one wall and the other wing touched the outstretched wing of the next cherubim, whose furthest wing touched the furthest wall. So they went across the whole width, which was 30 feet. So 30 feet and 15 feet tall. These were huge. Imagine being in this dark chamber with just candlelight incense and bread in the outer room, this huge curtain that was very, very heavy and thick and was 30 feet tall. And moving that aside and stepping into this room, and the first thing you see is two 30 by 15 feet tall cherubim staring at you. Kind of an intimidating place to be. Some of us are still intimidated to actually approach God directly. We think we need to approach God through a church, or through a minister, or through a priest, or through some intercessory, or through Yeshua, but not directly. Although in John's Gospel, Yeshua says to his apostles, don't ask me to pray for you. Go to the Father yourself because he loves you. I know that's not probably what you've been taught if you grew up in traditional churches, but that's what he taught. So, this idea of we have to be willing to face our fears and face what we feel are our inadequacies and unworthiness, and really humble ourselves to actually stand in the presence of God directly. Not think about it. You can think about God all day long. Not the same thing as standing in the presence. So, this is all part of the teachings around the ark. Now I'm going to tell you a part that hardly anybody ever talks about. And you might walk out thinking, nobody talks about this because who cares? I don't, that's a bunch of crap. But you might walk out of here thinking, maybe there's something to this. So, this is a pattern that God's teaching us about. Now there's these two beings, these angelic cherubic beings, a male and a female, bowing toward each other, and in the very center there's nothing. There's an empty space. If you are so inspired, look up a chart of your brain online when you go home sometime and take a look at it. There's two major glands in the center of the brain. One's called the pineal gland. One is called the pituitary gland. And they sit, the pineal up and behind, and the pituitary more forward and lower. Those glands control every single hormone in your body. And those glands produce chemicals that interact with each other. And they control your growth, they control your metabolic rate, they control all the glandular functions of the body, they control lots of things in your body. In ancient days, that was said that the pineal gland was the masculine aspect of God within us, and the pituitary gland was the feminine aspect of God within us. And that center was called the Holy of Holies. Same name. And in the East it was called the Tizratil, or the third eye. We've heard of that, yeah? So there's these now two glands that are facing each other in our brain, as there are two cherubim facing each other. And do you know what is between those two glands in your brain? Nothing. It's called the third ventricle. There's an empty space. Just like the empty space between the cherubim and the ark. So guess where this deep place is, where only the Spirit of God and you exist within your body, is that space. And in that space is where God speaks to you, because you're the high priest of your life. And nobody else is spoken to there, and nobody else goes in there. Just you. There isn't anything else there. And you may have had this experience and you may not. Hopefully, most of you are meditators, and definitely prayers. But the meditation is, prayer is a time of aligning ourselves with God and trying to help bring forward whatever blessing God is trying to bring forward for the people in our lives or ourselves. But meditation is paying attention to God, not asking for anything, but listening, being attentive. So if you meditate, you may have had an experience where you find yourself in this place that's really, really deep, or high if you prefer. Because deep and high are the same. The deeper within, the higher you go. And in that very, very deep place, you felt this profound sense of peace, even if your life was a disaster, or your body was falling apart, or your finances were falling apart. There's this sudden, unreasonably profound sense of peace that you have no right to have, given your circumstances, that Yeshua called the peace that passes understanding. And in that space is also where suddenly all the mental fog goes away, and you have clarity of what's actually going on. And in that space, no matter how your life is going, good, bad, indifferent, in that space, you feel completely loved and completely accepted without needing to change anything. You're completely loved. And you feel it. You don't hope that's true. You experience that as a real thing. That's this really deep place that people throughout the ages have talked about. I mean, way back to even people like the philosopher Descartes. Pineal gland was the organ in the body that he said was the voice of the soul. So this is really ancient stuff. And it's not been taught much in modern spiritual circles. So you can decide whether you want to work with this or not. But if you actually get a picture, like a chart, of the brain or a drawing of the brain, you'll see what I'm talking about. These two glands are the prominent glands in the very center of your brain. Like the pineal gland and the pituitary gland, if you drew a line through your temples and a vertical axis through the center of your head, right where those meet, that's where they are. And in between them is an empty space. How come? How come there's nothing there? Because that's the space that the Spirit of God moves in within us. Also, you may or may not know this, pineal gland, if you biopsy it, or remove it for that matter, if you look at it, it has a whole bunch of things in it because it does a lot of chemical functions. But one of the things in it that it has are thousands and thousands and thousands of photoreceptor cells, light receptor cells, like your retina. The only other place in your body that has those is your retina. Now, why in the world would a tiny, tiny gland in the very center and darkest part of your brain have light receptor cells? Well, what's this inner light that we talk about? For every spiritual action, there's a biological or physical counterpart of that enables that to take place in the physical body and in the physical consciousness. So the receptor for receiving that inner light, not the light of this flame, but the inner light, that's the receptor area for receiving that divine light. And it allows it to be transferred to the brain, to the mind, and to the body. So every time, we talk about, I don't know if you really look at this, but the Fillmores talked a lot, and Yeshua talked, and Kabbalah talks a lot, about how the body, everything in the Bible is, in addition to being literal, also has symbolism, the whole metaphysician part. It symbolizes something other than the literal part that it's talking about. So, for example, when you hear about in the Bible the right hand of God all the time, the right hand of God, it's like, well, what that means, God's right-handed? I mean, what is that? If you look at the ancient teachings about what was called the tree of life, it's an overview of the body. And the right hand in that chart is representative of love. And the left hand is representative of strength and judgment. So when you're talking about Yeshua being in the right hand of God, what the ancients would have heard is, he is in the loving kindness of God. When it talks about God will save you with his outstretched right hand, it means God's going to save you through his love. And they would have heard that. We don't, because we don't have those reference points anymore. So, one of the historical questions is, from the time of Moses to the prophet Jeremiah, after the prophet Jeremiah, the physical Ark of the Covenant, we don't have any idea where it is. It's gone. Was it destroyed? Was it hidden? It's just gone. We don't know. So where is the Ark of the Covenant, and does it still exist? Physically, I don't know. But something I do know is that was symbolic of something that's going on in us, that's still there, and that we can still access. But if we won't go to those deep places in ourselves, if all we do is say to ourselves, what do I think about? Wanda gave a great, I'm really sorry I missed it, but Wanda gave a great talk about coveting. I hope some of you heard that. So I can go home and think about that. Think about, coveting, do I covet? I can think about that. That's a good thing to do. That's not the same as going to the space I'm talking about. Where in that space, I lay down all the things I think coveting might be about and let God reveal to me what it actually is. And there are times I'd be willing to bet, I haven't talked to Wanda about this, but I'd be willing to bet there are times that Wanda or anybody else who's presented something up here has had an idea of what they're going to talk about, and as they start preparing for it, whether they write it out or just prepare inwardly, when they start preparing for it, suddenly they have an insight that they didn't have before, or a direction that they didn't think they were going to go that they end up going. Or they get up here, or Bob doing his meditation class, or you get up here and start doing it, and suddenly there's a new thing. It's like, oh, and you go with that. You know why that is? Because they're listening. They're not listening to the belief systems that they've been told they should adhere to. They're not listening to whatever their emotions might be in that moment, because emotions are transitory and God is not. And they're not listening to their body. I feel a little uncomfortable. I think I'll talk about how awful life is today. I feel good. I'll talk about how good life is today. It doesn't matter what's going on in your body. That's the body. It does what it does. It doesn't last permanently anyway. But your spirit, your soul, lasts forever. And when we learn to pay attention to that really deep place inside, that's when we start actually making the connections. And where do you suppose Yeshua got his teachings? Somebody told him all that stuff? Where do you suppose he got the power to heal and uplift? Where do you suppose he got the power to transform lives? Where do you suppose Moses got the power to do that? Where do you suppose St. Francis got the power to do that? Or Gandhi got the power to do that? Or Buddha or Krishna? Where did they get that power? Were they special and God liked them better than you? Oh, I like them, I don't like you. Or did they learn how to access something that maybe we don't access very often? C.S. Lewis, who is a Christian author and belonged to the Anglican Church, which was very traditional, C.S. Lewis wrote one time that he realized later in his life that if Christianity were doing its work, it would be producing thousands of little Christs everywhere. Yeshua said, "These things that I do, you shall do." So, to me, learning how to access that Spirit of God in us is where all of that comes from, in all those great teachers and great souls. And it's where it comes from in us too. And so the ark is just one more little clue of don't keep looking out here for something that's going to fulfill you in here. Don't keep thinking there's some secret God out there somewhere you're going to find. The secret is, it's not out there. It's right here. But not here on the forehead, but very, very deep in your consciousness. It's at the very center. God is at the center of everything, including you. So until you go to the center, the very, very, very center, you're just going to get radiations of it, but you're not going to experience the fullness of it. You know, we can get sunlight through the windows, but it's not the same as standing out in the sun. It's different. So we don't want reflections. We want the light. And to get to that light, you have to go to those deep places. And you have to be willing to go to those deep places. So, part of going to those deep places is recognizing that there isn't a time that God will be more accessible to you than now. There isn't a time that God was or will be more accessible to you than now. So, I'd like to sing you a little song and then we'll go into meditation. And we'll move on. So this is This is something I wrote many years ago after a meditation, for what that's worth. I call this the heart of Jesus because so many people argue about him, who he was and who he wasn't, and this is my take on it. You wander this world, always looking for me. Though you have eyes, they're blind to what you see. Seeking me elsewhere, beyond and far above. You miss the moment and all the gifts thereof. I am nothing less, and I am nothing more. I am not the end, I am just a door. The smile that you see in the eyes of a friend, that smile is me. When you touch someone in need, you're helping me. In the cries of the helpless, in the actions of the brave, in the hope of the hungry, in the innocent at play. This is where I live today. I am nothing less, and I am nothing more. I am the love and the longing for. To love what is before you, to give all that you are, to love what is before you, to give all that you are, to love what is before you, to give all that you are. That is the key to my heart. So let's just bring our attention inside to that Holy of Holies place. Knowing that the particulars are not so important as the recognition that there is a place within your being that the living Spirit of Almighty God actually dwells. And that there are no gates or bars or doors to that holy chamber. But there is something required to enter it. And that is willingness to be of humble service. So with a willing heart, we move toward that innermost place. And we might recall the words that God spoke to Moses as they were building the ark and the tabernacle. Take from the people whatever their hearts inspire them to contribute. Nothing more and nothing less. So may our hearts inspire us to move into this inner quiet, to move into the deep places in us. That are not limited by our beliefs, or our circumstances, or our feelings. but a space where we can touch that infinite being that we call God, that boundless love, and that timeless peace. Those are given in this silence for just a few moments. Let us receive them. Lord, may your Spirit be present now as it was then. May we stand before you in awe. And may we remember as we go forward what Timothy wrote to us centuries ago in his letter. The purpose of all this teaching is that there be love, coming from a sincere faith and a pure heart. Lord, we ask for your blessing upon every soul present here, those present in body and those present in spirit. May we have the humility to receive the grace you offer. Thank you for allowing us to live as your children. And thank you for this church for reminding us. Amen. Thank you all.